no doubt. All right, time now on the In-Wheel Time Car Talk Show for Konrad's Car Clinic. We're still talking about fluids.
Fluids. Last week we talked about transmission fluid and how the color is pretty important indicator of what's going on. Well, the same thing with brake fluid. Brake fluid should typically, when it's new, be like an amber color. A very light tan, maybe even to the point of being clear. And the reason they use brake fluid is it's what I call a force multiplier. It's the physics of hydraulics. If I have a 2-inch piston and I move it 1 inch through a line on the other end, and it doesn't matter how far away it can be, and in a car it could be 12, 14 feet away, a 1-inch piston is going to move 2 inches. So all of that force multiplying so that when I step on the brakes happen. So the fluid's a critical part of how that functions. You want to make sure that the fluid is clean. You want to make sure that the fluid's not contaminated. Brake fluid itself is hygroscopic. It's always wanting to absorb a little bit of moisture. So opening and closing your brake cap all the time is a bad thing to do because just a little bit of humidity in there can impact that. Brake fluid has to not just transmit hydraulic force, it also has to withstand pretty high amounts of heat. If you think about a pickup truck pulling off the highway, coming up to a stop sign, those brake rotors could be 600, 700, 800 degrees
red hot.
And they're inches away from 4 or 5 ounces of brake fluid inside your caliper. So that radiating heat is going to generate the heat inside the fluid.
Yeah.
So we talked earlier before we got on the air about DOT 3 fluid.
Yep.
Department of Transportation Standard 3, that's DOT 3, is a boiling point of 400 degrees. So the fluid, when it boils, that becomes a problem because now all of a sudden we've introduced air pockets in the brake fluid, and that's where that spongy pedal comes. The other problem is once it starts to absorb moisture, what happens to water at 212 degrees? It turns to steam. Mm-hmm. Now, that steam also creates a soft or a spongy brake pedal. If you watch your brake fluid color, that's going to give you an indication of when it needs to be replaced. But manufacturers know what's going on. As brake fluid becomes old, it becomes corrosive. And one of the things brake fluid does is, as it becomes corrosive, it begins to leach copper out of the inside of the system, whether it's copper out of the analog braking system or copper out of the metallized fuel or brake lines that are in the vehicle. And you see people will go in with like a little test strip to test your brake fluid. They're actually measuring the parts per million of copper. The funny thing is, Honda cars, when their brake fluid gets old, it turns green. Well, what color does copper turn
green
when it corrodes?
Yeah.
Green. So it's a good indication that your brake fluid needs to be changed when it starts to turn green. But different manufacturers tell you to change the fluid at different intervals, and I never really understand why everybody's variance. A lot of the Europeans say every 20,000 to 24,000 miles or every 2 years. A lot of the Asian imports will tell you every 30,000 miles. GM says every 45,000 miles you should change your brake fluid. Ford doesn't ever tell you to change your brake fluid at all. Mopar doesn't ever tell you to change your brake fluid at all. They all basically use a very similar fluid. So as the fluid ages, it needs to be changed.
What's the difference between regular, like a DOT 3, and silicone fluid, and can you mix the two?
You cannot mix the two at all. Silicone fluid's going to have a boiling temperature generally north of 600 degrees. DOT 3 is the factory fill for 99% of the vehicles out there. Yeah. And then there's also a DOT 4 fluid, which has a boiling point of above 500 degrees. So the DOT 4 fluid, you really don't see that as factory fill anywhere, but there's a lot of places that will put DOT 4 fluid, which is totally interchangeable with DOT 3. But silicone brake fluid really does not exist from an OEM. That's purely on a race car. And we can talk to Richard. How often does he change brake fluid? Probably every time he races a car. he puts fresh brake fluid in it. Why? Because he has to depend on the fluid doing what it's designed to do. So you always want to have fresh, new fortified fluid inside the vehicle. So again, light amber color is normal. As it begins to darken, it's time to think about it. If it gets black, you should have replaced it already. And it'll get so black, it'll stain the inside of the reservoir. And once that happens, the only way to clean that reservoir is basically to replace it. You can't put any cleaner inside of a brake fluid. Brake fluid, you don't want to intermix with anything at all because it'll affect its performance.
Wow. Very interesting. Yeah. So I'm glad that I had my Corvette brake fluid changed a couple of years ago because it never had been, and the car's 20 years old.
Right. And with that, you also have the clutch fluid. In a manual transmission with a hydraulic clutch, that's basically brake fluid that's in there that's also exposed to pretty high temperatures down there at the clutch. So you want to make sure you're changing that clutch fluid.
I just went ahead and changed the clutch.
Yep.
So with the clutch change, there goes the fluid.
Right,
and now it's got a little valve down there that it didn't have before.
That makes it easier to change
to do the fluid.
Right.
Yeah. Fluid flush.
Very good.
Thank you.
Fluid valve.
That's it. Okay.